In this, the 25th lesson in the course of Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we examine the role of economists as they advise governments of the consequences of policies designed to allocate scarce resources during war. The challenge faced by political leaders in many countries was and is how to maintain a large and expensive military while providing for other basic public goods and services. To most economists, all resources are scarce. This graph depicts what is called the production possibilities curve, given scarce resources available to produce goods of all types. What is certainly true is that few societies are able for very long to satisfy consumer needs and wants while diverting land, labor, and capital goods to a military with global obligations. This trade-off is commonly referred to as one of guns versus butter. Although these trade-offs were certainly made in the implementation of policy by the United States during the decades of hot and cold war interventions to counter the expansion of communist state socialism, those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder were in the group most directly affected by the rising costs of living under conditions of stagnant household incomes. One must look behind the mere numbers, which show the number of people living in poverty as well as the poverty rate continued to decline during the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies. An important question is how the government agencies define and measure poverty. As this graph shows, the poverty rate for African Americans and Hispanics remained far higher than the white majority. However, even among whites, the number of individuals categorized as poor has remained high. The statistics for 2017 are as follows. Note that whites, not Hispanic, have a poverty rate of 8.7%, while blacks have the highest rate of poverty, Asians a little higher than whites, and Hispanics slightly less than blacks. By mid-1967, Lyndon Johnson faced reality and tried to get the Congress to impose a 10% surtax, partly to reduce the deficit and partly to exert downward pressure on prices. Conservatives demanded that Johnson cut spending on domestic programs in return for approval of the surtax. Also at risk was the stability of the U.S. dollar in international markets. Pressure was mounting to raise the price for gold, effectively devaluing the dollar. The Consumer Price Index jumped 4% in 1968 and another 6% in 1969. We should ask who benefits and who loses when prices are rising. If your income is rising faster than prices, your standard of living is probably improving. On the other hand, although nominal wages were increasing, many workers were pulled into higher tax brackets, so that their real income increased very little or not at all. Note that this chart shows real wages increasing well into the 1970s. What workers lost in actual disposable income, they often made up in non-taxable benefits, particularly for health care. By the late 1960s, it was clear that the U.S. dollar was no longer as good as gold. By 1969, when Richard Nixon entered the White House, the U.S. gold supply had fallen to just over $8 billion at the stated price of $35 per ounce. European banks and European branches of U.S. banks held nearly $60 billion of U.S. currency obtained in exchange for exports to U.S. businesses, consumers, and all levels of government. U.S. corporations left huge dollar balances in the European banks because they paid higher rates of interest than were obtainable in the United States. In response, in August of 1971, the Nixon administration suspended convertibility of the dollar into gold, and the dollar was devalued against other currencies. Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury, John Connally, said to the President, "I'm not sure this program will work, Mr. President, but I am sure that nothing less will work." After 1971, the value of the U.S. dollar floated against that of other currencies. The market price of gold in dollars skyrocketed, as did the supply of currency and credit. The Nixon administration responded next by getting the Congress to impose wage and price controls, and the Federal Reserve stimulated credit markets by lowering the discount rate charged to member banks and expanding the money supply. For a period long enough to get Richard Nixon reelected, the economy stabilized. Then all hell broke loose. The immediate effect of suddenly opening the gold market to private purchasers stimulated a period of intense speculation in gold. To jump ahead a decade, by 1982 the price of gold reached $700 an ounce. As the dollar continuously lost value, the price of crude oil and other commodities also increased along with that of gold. The U.S. and many other nations were now trying to cope with what was called stagflation. Exacerbating the economic problems experienced by the United States was the escalating price of land, a rising cost that producers were less and less able to pass on in the markets because of stiff foreign competition. In a statement delivered in February 1974 before the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns tried to make sense of the turbulent economic situation. Burns stated, "The character of the recent inflation has been very different from the advances in the general price level that troubled us in earlier business cycle expansions. When an economy is beset by inflationary forces of such exceptional character, direct controls over wages and prices are apt to be rather ineffective. The classical tools of economic stabilization, that is, general monetary and fiscal policies, can be more helpful at such a time, but limitations on their practical use in the environment of 1973 must also be recognized." Among the small group of economists who fully understood the power of land markets and the public policies that drove them, Mason Gaffney almost continuously provided his colleagues in the economics community with rational arguments for reform. In a paper presented in 1972 at a Resources for the Future forum, he stated, "Congress needs to take the fun out of land speculation by hitting capital gains in a dozen ways, thus encouraging cities to use their capital budgets to serve their median citizens rather than the strong hands who hold speculative land and inveigle councilmen. Washington might also share the social dividend of school finance, raising the revenue by kinds of tax reform that encourage better land use. Congress needs to stop the competitive underassessment of land by local assessors, which makes a mockery of the federal income tax by letting people avoid taxes by depreciating land not just one, which amounts to complete exemption of land income, but several times, which amounts to a large subsidy for holding title to land. Following the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Arab members of OPEC announced they would no longer ship oil to nations supporting Israel, At the same time, other OPEC nations agreed to raise their prices 400%. For the United States and many other countries, the result was a deepening stagflation. Prices and unemployment were rising at the same time, a key assertion of those economists in the Keynesian camp, as evidenced by what was referred to as the Phillips curve, was now disproven by unforeseen real-world dynamics. Cracks in the post-war economic system were appearing. Political leaders and some economists believed a combination of reduced governmental regulation and subsidies would stimulate competition and yield significant improvements in economic performance. After Gerald Ford finished out Richard Nixon's second term, the challenge of trying to unwind the effects of 3 decades of contradictory economic policies fell to an ill-equipped Jimmy Carter and his economic team. Looking for competition to improve efficiencies and provide better pricing and service to the traveling public, President Jimmy Carter directed economist Alfred Kahn to head the effort to deregulate the airline industry. For the first time in some years, questions were being raised about economics and what economists actually knew about how to achieve sustainable economic growth. Many were coming to believe, as stated here, that economics is the science of explaining tomorrow why the predictions you made yesterday didn't come true today. In 1976, a book with the title Economists at Bay was published. The author was Robert Lekachman, professor of economics at Lehman College, City University in New York. He felt he had good reason to question the usefulness of economics to society. Lekachman wrote, "When bright people say stupid things, the question inevitably raises, why is their perception of reality so blurred? Good economists are bright men and women. They are possessed of splendid academic credentials and arcane analytical techniques. They speak in tongues as difficult to comprehend as the dialects of nuclear physicists. Moreover, most economists are individuals of goodwill, eager to extirpate poverty, redeem the cities, diminish pollution, feed the hungry, heal the sick, and house the unsheltered. All the same, economists do make the oddest statements and promulgate undue quantities of faulty prophecy and policy prescription." Lekachman was an economist outside the mainstream, a proponent of strong government interventions in the economic affairs of a nation. When he died in 1989, the president of City University's Graduate Center wrote of him, "He brought a liberal, left-wing Marxist point of view to economics, but he was in no sense an ideologue. He never argued in generalities, and his openness and objectivity captivated even those who disagreed with his basic positions." The sad state of economics as a science was pointed to by Fred Harrison, writing in the publication Land and Liberty in 1973. Tons of volumes are produced annually, each one allegedly pushing the horizons of our objective understanding of man and society a little further out. Sadly, the brave man who ventures into the plethora of new books, theses, papers, is more than likely going to lose his way and end up either misinformed or totally cynical, particularly where the social sciences, the major academic growth industry, are concerned. At the same time, critics of Keynesian demand management introduced what they said was a too long ignored aspect of how markets perform, which came to be referred to as supply-side economics. These supply-side perspectives originated with Herbert Stein, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under Presidents Nixon and Ford. In the book, The Fiscal Revolution in America, published in 1969, he expressed a view that in order to yield its beneficial effect on government revenue, a tax reduction had to be of the right kind. It had to be a cut of the higher income tax rates, which would induce the saving classes to invest in productive United States enterprises rather than put their money in tax-exempt securities or foreign bonds or hoard it or consume it. The additional investment would raise the national income and therefore the tax base, enough to yield enlarged revenues even at the lower tax rates. Stein noted that reductions of federal income taxes in 1924, 26, and 28 were each followed by an increase in federal revenues. He did not explore whether this occurred because of specific circumstances or even whether the increase in revenue might have been even greater had the tax reductions distinguished between income earned by producing goods and services and income derived from purely speculative activities. Then, in the mid-1970s, a Wall Street Journal columnist named Jude Wanniski came to the conclusion that an economic law operated to achieve the desired economic outcomes. In a famous meeting that occurred in 1974, Wanniski invited UCLA economics professor Arthur Laffer to explain the fundamentals of supply-side policies to Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. At this meeting, Art Laffer drew this graphic. This graph, ever since referred to as the Laffer curve, made the argument that there is a maximum rate of taxation above which will cause the revenue generated to begin to fall due to the disincentive to engage in taxable economic activity. Thus, government should reduce the highest marginal tax rates on individuals, on business, and on capital gains to a level that will maximize revenue without harming the economy. Professor Laffer pointed to the fact that his arguments came straight from John Maynard Keynes. Laffer wrote, "To create wealth will increase the national income, and a large proportion of any increase in the national income will accrue to an exchequer. Nor should the argument seem strange that taxation may be so high as to defeat its object, and that, given sufficient time to gather the fruits, a reduction of taxation will run a better chance than an increase of balancing the budget." What Arthur Laffer provided, of course, was an opportunity for his colleagues in the discipline to challenge his theories against the historical record and current behavior of economic players in the United States and other societies following the path of reduced marginal tax rates on individual incomes and on the sale of financial assets, that is, so-called capital gains. And so the 1970s ends with theory and reality poised for collision. We reach the end of Lesson 25.